So let's talk about corporate liquidation. So corporate liquidation, this is the last step in the corporate life cycle, right? We talked about formation, we talked about operations, distributions, redemptions. Finally, the corporation is going to liquidate. So we have a checklist here where the first thing it really focuses on is when you have a corporate liquidation, you've got distributions that take place. Now, the question is, if you have a distribution, is it going to be a liquidation distribution? Or is it going to be just a normal Module 8, right? Module 8 versus Module 9 distribution? That's the question. Because the rules are going to differ. Module 8 distributions, you apply distributions using the three-part waterfall for the shareholders. But Module 9 distributions, you get the subtract away basis, and there's also even some special non-recognition rules that we're going to talk about. Okay? So this first page right here, what it's talking about is, do we have a complete liquidation? In this class, you'll know from the facts it's complete liquidation. But this is something you have to address in practice. It might not be. It might be a partial liquidation. It might not be a liquidation at all. In that case, the distribution rules, again, you apply Module 8, not Module 9. But if it's a complete liquidation, you apply the Module 9 liquidation rules. Is there a formal plan? Is the shareholder a corporation or individual? That's important. So question 3. The reason why this is important is because if the shareholder is a corporation, we might be able to get a special non-recognition rule. A special non-recognition rule. Okay, I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. So if it does qualify as complete liquidation, we apply the checklist below, which are Module 9. If it's not complete liquidation, we apply Module 8, the 4-part analysis, to the distribution. Because again, the idea here is, hey, how'd you get there? Oh, I see. I see what happened. Keep that to the side then, that's fine. So the issue is that with liquidation, there's going to be distributions. So here actually are the checklists. The first part is part of the checklist, but that's again just explaining to you that it has to be a complete liquidation for these rules to apply. If it's not, it's going to be Module 8. Now, when you're thinking about liquidations, there's really 2 sets of rules. There's the general rules, and there's the special rules. Basically, the general rules apply to almost all distributions. There's a special rule for non-recognition if you meet certain criteria, and I'll explain what that is. So first, we're going to talk about the general rules. So think about what's going on here. Corporation is dissolving, liquidating. It's going away. It's got property. It's got assets. Assume, by the way, for this class that all the liabilities have been paid off, unless I tell you otherwise. Unless there's a liability and a problem that a shareholder is going to take on. So the corporation is going to distribute out assets to the owners. The question is, does the corporation have any tax consequences? And what about the shareholders as a result of liquidation? The answer is yes to both. They do have tax consequences. We have to consider both sides. We have to consider the corporate consequences and the shareholder consequences. So the general rule, we're focusing first on the shareholder. How much gain or loss does the shareholder recognize? So we're going to apply our section 1001, amount realized minus adjusted basis. The amount realized is going to be whatever the shareholder receives. Fair market, we'll use our normal amount realized formula. So fair market value or the cash received, right? The adjusted basis, this is very important. Please put this in your notes. We're talking about the adjusted basis that the shareholder has in the stock. This is always where students get confused because in your problem, you're going to see there's multiple bases, multiple fair market values. You're using the adjusted basis of the stock. What's the character? Character is going to be a capital asset. Why? Because you're giving up your stock. Capital. Finally, what's the basis of any property received? It's going to be fair market value. We don't worry about any liabilities. Always fair market value. Easy, right? Amount realized adjusted basis. We've been doing that all semester. Characters, capital gain, capital loss. Short-term, long-term, depending on how long you held the stock. And then finally, fair market value for the property received is the basis. Easy. That's the general rule. What about the consequences to the corporation? So a corporation, general rule is, we also have section 1001. It's going to be the amount realized minus adjusted basis. Well, you're like, okay, what do you mean amount realized adjusted basis? Corporation is getting rid of property. That property could have has value on it, and if the property is appreciated or depreciated in value, you get to take the loss or the gain on the last final year of the corporation's tax return, corporate income tax return. So this amount the amount realized is going to be the normal thing. It usually is going to equal the fair market value of the property, but there's actually a rule, just like we saw in Module 8. It's going to be the greater of the liability amount on the property or the fair market value, whichever is greater. The greater of those two. So remember we had that rule in Module 8 as well for distributions. It's the greater of the liability on the property being extinguished or the fair market value. Adjusted basis is going to be the adjusted basis of the property itself. The property distributed, if it's subject to a liability, as I mentioned, we focus on the greater of the liability of the fair market value rule. And that's what you use. This special section 336D related party loss, I'm not going to test you on that, but that's obviously important for practice. So you can go ahead and skip that part. What is the character of the gain or loss? The character is going to be depending on what kind of asset it is. If it's a 1231 asset, it's going to be 1231 gain or loss. If it's a capital asset held by the corporation, capital gain, capital loss. Ordinary asset, ordinary gain or loss. What's the effect of earnings and profits? Well, the corporation is liquidating, so it disappears. Okay, so the remaining part of the checklist focuses on the special rule. And before we talk about that, which we're going to talk about next class, I just want to do one problem with you, just to show you how this works. At least set it up. So let's just look at problem 1. And we'll come back to problem 1 next class as well, but at least want to set it up with you. So problem 1, we've got Pineapple Express Corporation was formed many years ago to provide private charter flights to Hawaii. Coconut owns 600 out of 1,000 outstanding shares of common shares. Coconut, an individual, acquired 400 of those other shares for $50,000 approximately 20 years ago. Coconut acquired the other 200 shares for $1.9 million. Pineapple Express decides to liquidate. The corporation sells its assets, adjusted basis in the assets of $1 million for $10 million cash. Consider the consequences to both to Pineapple Express, which is the corporation, and also Coconut, who's the shareholder. We're told Coconut's an individual. So we know that Coconut owns 60% of the corporation. We don't know who owns the other 40%, right? We're not told. Do you see that problem? There's nothing in the problem that says who owns the other 400 shares. Everyone got that? Nothing in the problem tells us who owns the other 400 shares of stock. So the thing is that the special rule I mentioned that we're going to see more about next class, I'll go in the checklist next class, you have to have at least one corporate shareholder, and the corporate shareholder has to own 80% or more. So since Coconut is an individual, we don't care who the other shareholders are. For the special rule is not going to apply to anybody. Why? Because even if the other shareholder was a corporation, all they own is 40%, right? So that means the special rule is not going to apply to this in this situation. Everyone see that? You have to be a corporate shareholder, and you have to be 80% or more ownership, control. That's the only time the special rule applies. So that means that for Coconut, the individual, we're going to apply the general rules, and then for the corporation, we're going to apply the general rules as well. So here's the issue in this problem, okay? In this problem, if we look at the consequences to, let's start with the consequences to the, let's do the consequences of the corporation today. I'll set up the problem for the shareholder next class and we'll finish it. So corporation, again, the general rule applies. By the way, when you're doing these problems on the exam, you're looking for liquidation, decides to liquidate. That's how you know, hey, it's a liquidation problem. So first question, what is this? Liquidation, formation, distribution, it's liquidation. From there, since we know it's liquidation, the next question, is it the general rule or the special rule? We just explained the general rule applies, not the special rule, because again, there's no corporate shareholder owning more than 80% or more. So it's general rule. So for corporation, all we're going to do is we're going to take amount realized minus adjusted basis. The amount realized is the greater of the fair market value or any liability relief. There's no liabilities in this problem. Therefore, we use the fair market value of the property. So the corporation sold its assets for $10 million, and it's going to distribute out the cash to its to the owners, to Coconut and its other owners. So that means amount realized is the $10 million. The adjusted basis of the assets is $1 million, not the stock. That's for Coconut. That means that the corporation has a $9 million gain. The character would be whatever it is, right? If it's 1231 assets, it'd be $9 million of 1231 gain. And again, earnings and profits just goes away. So let me set up the problem for the shareholder, and we'll finish it next class. So the shareholder, again, the general rule applies, right? General rule. Amount realized minus adjusted basis. Amount realized is what the shareholder gets. The shareholder, Coconut. Okay, we're told in A. By the way, this is A. My apologies. This is A. So, Coconut gets $6 million. That's the amount realized. The adjusted basis, we're told the adjusted basis is $50,000 plus $1.9 million, which is $1.95 million. However, some of that stock is treated as long-term and some of it is short-term. Why? Because some of it was purchased 20 years ago and some of it was purchased earlier this year. So the problem is going to be, and we're going to do this next class, is we have our amount realized and adjusted basis, but how do we determine what portion of this transaction is long-term, what's short-term? Because it's obviously going to be gain, right? Does everyone see that? It's going to be gain. And we'll pick up with that next class.